Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk a bit about the books that I've been reading this week. And I'm slowly getting back into the swing of things with reading, although I've had a couple of days of not really reading, but there we go. Getting back into it as this year starts. And I've got a few books that I want to talk about, so let's get started. First up, an advanced copy of a book that is due to come out very, very soon, and that is All the Young Queers, aged 16 to 24 years by Nathan Evans. And so this is a really inventive set of short stories or writing pieces that essentially mirror specific parts of growing up as a young kid as part of the LGBTQIA plus community. And it's really interesting in the way that it does it by looking at different time periods and different ways of being a young person dealing with various parts of your sexuality or your identity. So in one of these, there's the kind of the joys and terrors and excitement that all comes with your first crush or anything like that. There's another short story that is entirely done as a sort of dating app conversation and the kind of various ways that these people try to find out a bit more about each other, and with a really funny ending as well. And it really navigates, I think, so many clever parts of what it means to be a young queer person, basically. And yeah, I thought it was just really fun and really inventive that these, as much as they are sort of short stories that can be read together as part of a bigger whole, there is something about each individual one is a specific it's specifically crafted to be part of something. So you know, like the dating app conversation, or this exciting story about the idea of running off with somebody you've just met at a protest in the 80s. You know, these stories really tried to tell a specific period of time, and I thought that was really delightful and really fun as well. Next up, I read Brainwyrms by Alison Rumfitt, and this is a wild ride of a book. So her first book, Tell Me I'm Worthless, was this bold and really dark book that was sort of haunted house, body horror, trans experience, loads of other things going on. And Brainwyrms in many ways carries on the same thing, sort of themes in some ways. It particularly looks at parasites, as kind of the cover gives way to, and particularly power dynamics, body horror, lots of other things. Basically, lots of really big horror tropes appear in this book in interesting ways. I read this as part of a book club, many of whom hated it, and I'm mixed on it. I think what she does do really well is use these horror tropes to explore elements of the queer experience, particularly the trans experience, in interesting ways. But this is not a book for the faint-hearted, in that there are multiple scenes with really intense bits of body horror, gore, violence, sex that feels quite sketchy and uncomfortable. There's a lot going on. This is not a nice, light, easy read in that sense. And even though there are parts that are funnier or are lighter, this is an intense book. Its whole, you know, a big part of this book is the kind of shock factor of what it's going for. And so there are some parts that I thought were unnecessarily puerile and kind of over the top. And I get that that's the point of this book. It's also at times a bit much, where I think large elements of this book could have worked really well as a very focused short story that used an analogy of parasites to make a wider point. That said, if you are a lover of horror and don't mind a bit of grotesque, gruesome sort of styling, then this may be the book for you. But it is a lot. You know, there are a few moments in this book that I will probably never forget, and not necessarily in a good way. It's an experience, let's say that. It feels like watching some kind of bootleg horror film that was banned in several countries. It kind of has that feel to it. It's a lot. Yeah, there's not much more to say about it, really. Next up, a piece of non-fiction that I think is really deeply inventive, and that is The Strangers by Ekow Eshun. And it reminded me a lot of Margot Jefferson's Constructing a Nervous System, because what it does is it takes black figures from history, and black men in this case, and it seeks to give them back a voice, or seeks to reconstruct a narrative around them. And in Margaret Jefferson's book, Constructing a Nervous System, Margaret Jefferson draws a personal line between herself and these figures, like Nina Simone and a few other black women. And in this book, The Strangers, I think what Eshun does so spectacularly is create something entirely new and different for them. So these almost read like fictional parts, as in he's constructed a narrative for these people and writes in their voices. So these men are kind of reimagined as current living day people, or as people telling their autobiographies. And so it's this incredibly creative book, because it means that we are inside the heads of some of these black men who often weren't allowed as many opportunities to really talk for themselves. So Justin Fashanu, the UK's first openly gay football player, is one of the people in this, and being able to read through his eyes, or through his voice rather, is so fascinating, because so much of his story was dictated by other people. So much of his story was the media narrative around him, or whatever headlines he was allowed, rather than his own voice. And so this is so fascinating, that this whole book is this sort of reconstruction of people's lives. And when I was listening to this as an audiobook, it almost read as fiction. I had to occasionally remind myself that I was inside the mind of a certain person, and this was not a fictional account, but it's a sort of reconstructed, fictionalized version of a non-fiction thing. So I thought it was really clever, and just an utterly inventive way to do biography, I thought, that feels still very authentic and true to the men being referenced in the book. And last but not least, I read Shari Franke's memoir, The House of My Mother. And this is really interesting, I think, in several ways, for me, at least, for what it signifies about what's coming next. So Shari Franke is the daughter of Ruby Franke, who was a family YouTuber. And although that isn't necessarily something I watch, I don't find family vlogging channels that interesting personally, I find the topic of family vlogging so fascinating, and I'm always really keen to watch video essays of people talking about how unfair some of those scenarios are, that essentially the young children in these never really get to advocate for themselves. They never really get to consent to what's happening around them. They are tools in their parents' business empire, essentially. And so it's really interesting that this is probably among the first wave that we're going to see of people aging into being able to write their own memoirs and escape from those situations and talk about what happened to them. And so Shari Franke, I think, is a really fascinating figure in this, and I think she writes this really well. And it reminds me a bit of I'm Glad My Mum Died, that came out a couple of years ago, because it's a really unflinching memoir, but at the same time, she's really seeking to find some way of understanding her mother. And I think what's really heartbreaking in some ways is throughout the book, Shari Franke only ever really talks about her mum by her first name, as Ruby. She stops being able to call her mum quite early into this story. And the book starts by trying to understand where Ruby Franke has come from and what her motivations were for being a bit like she has been. You know, maybe she didn't really feel like she had anything, and so once she's been given this chance to have a business empire, she takes it. But it also looks at the various difficulties that the family go through in order to be able to get there. Her mother becomes increasingly involved in quite cult-like programs. So there's a counselling program that has a sort of veneer of religiosity to it, or spirituality to it, but really is a smoke screen for being something a bit cultier and a bit more of a power grab, but also with these really messed up ways of looking at the world, where it talks a lot about, you know, the pain of children being a good sign because it shows that you're doing a good job as a parent, and all of these things. And so Shari Franke throughout this book is basically arguing firstly about family vlogging's dangers, but also talking about her own personal experience of having to essentially have this odd mental battle for years with her mother, who in many ways controls access to so many other parts of their family or of financial freedom or of many other things. And so it's a memoir of emotional abuse, which doesn't sound like the cheeriest thing, and it's not, but I think it's so incisively written that I found it so fascinating to see how Shari Franke is able to articulate the things that have happened to her and what peace now looks like to her. Really harrowing reading, but a really essential one, I think, for understanding that difficulty of what it means to be a teenager whose most embarrassing or awkward moments are on camera, and never being able to get that back, or never being able to get that scrubbed off the internet that always exists in some form. And these young children often have to live with that, and they become money-making tools for their parents. It's fascinating, if really difficult to read. Yeah, a fascinating book, I think. So those are the books I've been reading this week. I hope you're having a lovely reading week yourself, and a lovely week more generally, and are keeping okay. I know that this month is a bit of a tricky one for a lot of people, including currently myself. So we're getting through it, but I hope you're keeping really well. And thank you everybody for really lovely comments recently. I'm a little bit behind in responding to comments, but I will be catching up hopefully soon. Speak soon and look after yourselves. Thank you. Bye-bye.